All right, everyone. Sorry for that technical snafu, but we are back live with Ben Shields, talking about his new book, The Sports Strategist. Ben, you were in the midst of discussing the 5 characteristics that you think every successful sports strategist must possess. If you want,
Yes.
feel free to quickly mention the first 4 and then continue where you were.
Well, I think that we left off on the one about student of technology, and the minute we started talking about technology, this thing goes down. But anyway, just to remind everybody, the 5 characteristics of sports strategists, and this is based on our research of a number of different successful organizations and leaders in the sports industry. Sports strategists have an interdisciplinary view. They are problem solution oriented. They are committed to differentiation, always asking the question of what makes their organization different and unique to its customers. They are 4 students of technology. They know the latest trends in that area, and then 5, they are revenue focused. So those are the 5 key characteristics of what makes someone a successful sports strategist.
Okay. So in the book, you say one of the first things that a strategist needs to do is to be able to clearly identify their brand or their team or their organization. So in your research, which 2, 3, 4 brands or organizations really stood out to you in terms of understanding this concept and succeeding in not only developing an identity, but really being able to communicate that identity?
Well, Mark, our overall thesis is that sports organizations must win as businesses without necessarily winning on the field. And I would argue that probably the best example of this type of organization is the Dallas Cowboys. Now, it's been about 19 years of relative mediocrity for the Cowboys. And nevertheless, they are, as of about a month ago, according to Forbes, the most valuable franchise in the NFL at $3.2 billion. In fact, this is after 3 straight seasons of 8-8, and all odds are on a similar record for this year. But what makes them so valuable? I mean, first of all, they have a very strong identity as America's team. This is something that goes back decades. It evokes nostalgia. It evokes patriotism. Thanksgiving afternoon, everybody in America is watching the Cowboys as part of our cultural fabric. So no matter whether they win or lose, they are still America's team, and people feel emotionally connected to that identity. I think the other things that make the Cowboys really interesting is that they have understood how to manage narratives and facilitate storylines about the team. You've got Jerry Jones as almost the P.T. Barnum, the ringleader of the organization. You have Tony Romo as the leading man, the guy that never seems to quite be able to get it right. You have Dez Bryant as the wide receiver who says he's not a prima donna, but sometimes may be. And then, of course, Jason Garrett, who's perpetually on the hot seat as the coach. You put all these characters, plus a few others that I didn't mention here, into the mix, and you've got a reality show broadcast live 24/7, 365, down from Dallas. So you've got a strong identity, you have really compelling storylines on an annual basis, daily basis, and I think to add another key factor into the mix here, they have built a theme park in Jerry's World that is not only a destination for the 8 regular season games, because they haven't been in the playoffs recently, but it's also a destination for fans and tourists throughout the year. So you have a franchise that has built an extremely successful business without relying on winning to do so, and the Cowboys are a great example. Another one that comes to mind is actually a little bit newer than the Dallas Cowboys, and that's the Brooklyn Nets. It's very difficult to transition a franchise from one city to another, and while the transition for this team wasn't all that far in actual miles, it was a challenge. And the key strategy that the Nets prioritized throughout this transition process was tying the identity of the team to the identity of Brooklyn. And Jay-Z, as a headliner for this transition, was absolutely critical. Even his influence on the design of the brand identity, the uniforms, the sort of the black and white look, really sort of evoked that Brooklyn identity. Even when you go to the arena, there are local Brooklyn foods and drink that you can enjoy right there in Barclays Center, as opposed to having to walk around Park Slope. So, that's a way to sort of enter into a new community by really pushing an identity that closely ties you to that community. Brooklyn Nets, I think, have done a good job at it.
Sounds good. Another key aspect that you guys emphasize is the ability to create and craft a crisis management blueprint. Now, I'm going to get into specifics of the NFL and a whole lot of situations going on in the league right now, but first, can you sort of just step back and give viewers an idea of what you think a successful blueprint looks like?
Well, this may seem like an obvious first answer, but the most important thing to do is put every measure in place to avoid the crisis in the first place. And while it sounds like a very simple approach, often that is very difficult. And really what can help prevent crises to begin with is making sure that you have a strong culture and a culture of accountability. And we see some sports organizations certainly have that, and others do not, and that's where they get into trouble. In terms of crafting a strong crisis blueprint, I think you have to make sure that you're almost planning for the inevitable scenarios. And you have to sort of do a little bit of scenario planning so that when something hits, you know that first of all you have to gather the information, understand the truth, because that's ultimately what a lot of people are looking for. What is the truth in this situation? So you have to be able to evaluate and gather information very quickly. You have to then be able to develop your response, pick your spokesperson, and then begin the process of trying to quickly and ethically heal the situation. But again, effective crisis management starts with avoiding it in the first place, but then putting a plan in place that takes advantage of different scenarios based on what the true information is.
Okay, so given that, let's dig a little deeper into the NFL right now. I think first and foremost, let's look at the Vikings and Adrian Peterson. The team sort of flip-flopped their policy. They said he was going to play. Last night they decided that he's not going to play. He's off on the exempt list right now. What's been your reaction to how they've handled this situation and continue to handle it as it still has moving parts?
Well, remember that in crisis situations, perception is reality. Perception is reality. And the back and forth, the inconsistency, is what gets organizations in trouble. So when one decision is made and then a matter of hours later another decision is made, the result is, the perception is, that the people in power may not be in 100% control of the situation. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. We're just talking about the perception. So I think what's gotten that organization into a little bit of a difficult situation now is just the inconsistency. Really critical in crisis to the extent that you can be as consistent as possible in your messaging.
Okay, so building off of that, let's look at the Ray Rice saga. First with the viewpoint of the Ravens, but then stepping back, looking at the league as a whole and how it handled the Ray Rice situation and I think we're up to four current players with domestic violence or child abuse issues.
Well, the Ray Rice situation drives some of the point I was making earlier about what is the truth. Did the decision makers see the video before the ruling was handed down? That's ultimately the crux of the issue. And because there's a lot of question about the truth, the conversation continues. So I think, until that resolves itself, there's going to be a lot of questions about the situation for both the Ravens and the NFL. I think the NFL is also, again, perception is reality, but they're getting a lot of questions about their inconsistency. One ruling for one player, another approach for another player, and that's where it gets sort of difficult from a fan perspective. The other thing I would say is that there's a really interesting piece about Commissioner Goodell in the New York Times a few days ago, just sort of laying out some of the difficulties that he's had as a leader, some of these crisis situations. And credibility is very important in a crisis situation as well. And because whether it was the Bounty Gate or Spygate or you name it, there have been a number of situations that Commissioner Goodell has had to deal with, and that's accumulated over time some doubts about his leadership. So it's this situation in isolation, certainly, but the organization's also having to deal with some of the baggage from the previous rounds of crisis, and that's a factor at play here too.
Okay, so building off that, we got a question from one of your good friends, Mike Trudell, another proud Medill alum.
Go Cats!
Given everything that the league is going through right now, what effect do you think, if any, is it going to have on the league's bottom line?
In the short term, I don't think we're going to see significant effects on the bottom line. Long term, I'm still holding my breath, only because of the precedent in the industry. There was a time in this country when horse racing and boxing and baseball were the headlining sports, and we can't say that right now. And I think while each of those sports, particularly horse racing and boxing, had different reasons for their decline, ethical issues sort of were at play for both of them. Some corruption played a role, I think, in boxing and to some extent in horse racing as well. I think that the NFL certainly is strong as it ever has been right now, but over time you may see the sport decline because of some of these larger ethical, cultural issues. Is it going to happen next year? Absolutely not. Is it going to happen the following year? No. All I'm saying is that sometimes these larger cultural and ethical issues could take a long-term toll on a sport, and we've seen it already in the sports industry.
Okay, sounds good.
Good question, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, for submitting that one. I'm going to go in a different direction now. I'm going to read you a quote that you guys have in the book. You say, whether the format is a 140-character tweet or a feature film, the art of storytelling through character, plot, and setting is more important today than ever before. When it comes to a sports strategist, why do you think this is the case?
I think, first and foremost, information overload in our society. I think stories are one of the rare pieces of communication content that can break through and actually connect with an audience. The difference now, especially in the social media stage that we're in, when there's a good story, that is shared. And it just stimulates word of mouth in our network culture. So you have the advantage of stories being able to break through, and then you also have the advantage of stories being shared throughout our social community. And that's why we focus so much on narrative in the book.
All right, sounds good. Speaking of social media, certainly touching on your previous role at ESPN, and you joked about this before, to be successful you need to be a master of new technologies. When it comes to social media, how do you suggest, or how have you evaluated what platform or what network may be best for your industry or your organization, and then what do you suggest to fellow strategists?
Sure. It's tempting to want to try everything. Believe me. I mean, there are so many interesting and new social media platforms out incredibly useful to your organization. But before you go down that path, you have to ask yourself the question, what is my goal here? I'll tell you a quick little story. So you remember Second Life, Mark?
Yeah.
There was a time when Second Life was the darling of the media industry. And we saw some sports organizations build virtual places within Second Life. Looking back on it, you say, okay, that was good. They were sort of moving into a new area, experimenting, but you never really could understand what the goal was. And so, you're pouring all those resources and time into this new place without necessarily accomplishing a goal. So what I would say to anyone trying to use social media, make sure you first ask the question of what is your goal? What is the audience you're trying to reach? And then you can take a look at various platforms to help you accomplish that goal. There could be a situation where a specific sports team wants to connect more effectively with the teenage audience or the college age audience. In which case, Snapchat could be a viable platform for that organization based on the demographics and the usage. Whereas, frankly, Facebook may not be as effective in that particular example. So it goes back to some very basic questions about what your goals are and what audience you're trying to reach. And then you can kind of put together a portfolio of social platforms to help you accomplish those goals.
Great, sounds good. You've been great in the amount of time that you've given so far, Ben. I'm going to let you go on this one. You mentioned the Cowboys, you mentioned the Nets. In all the research you guys put into this book, what athletes, teams, organizations besides those two really impressed you the most in terms of the strategy that they use to build and develop a successful identity?
Well, I've always been a big fan of the Seattle Sounders football club. The identity of that club is the fans. It is a fan-centered identity. It's a sports democracy. And that's a great concept in a vacuum, but what it made it even more effective in the Seattle market is because of some of the heartache that those fans had felt because of the departure of the Sonics to Oklahoma City. So by bringing this organization to town and using the name of some of their previous soccer clubs as well, and putting it into the fans' hands was a brilliant strategy that clearly understood what fans were looking for from a sports team, that sports democracy. And I think also they have been very successful in learning from best practices of European football clubs. If you look at one of their match days, fans are wearing scarves, they're chanting in the stands, they're marching to the stadium, and I think that combination of sports democracy in a somewhat battered sports market with this European soccer club best practices, you had a very interesting formula that has very quickly endeared this team to the community, whether they win or lose. And again, if you want to have success as a business person in sports, it's about finding those ways to succeed without necessarily winning on the field. And that's what we focus on in the book.
I don't think I could come up with a better ending than that, so we'll take it right there, Ben. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And,
thank you, Mark. It's been an absolute pleasure, and maybe the Wildcats will get a win this weekend.
All right, we'll see. We'll hope.
I said maybe.
And to all the viewers out there, thank you guys for watching. Keep an eye out for future Medill Sports Hangouts. Thanks. Have a great night.
Take care.